Jake Anders had been a long-haul trucker for over 2 decades. He was used to the quiet solitude of the open road, the long stretches of highway under the moonlit sky, and the hum of his truck's engine keeping him company. But this route, a desolate stretch of highway that cut through the remote Appalachian Mountains, had a reputation. Truckers who took this route often reported strange occurrences, accidents, and sightings. Jake didn't believe in ghost stories, but something about this route always made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It was late in the evening when Jake set out, the sky already dark with thick clouds. His rig was fully loaded, and he had hours ahead of him before his next stop. The first few hours were uneventful, with only the occasional car passing by. But as the night deepened, Jake felt an eerie stillness settle over the road. The trees that lined the highway seemed to press in, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward him. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught something in the distance, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first he thought it was a hitchhiker, but as he drew closer he realized it was an old woman dressed in tattered clothes. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, and her hand was outstretched, as if beckoning him. Jake's heart raced. Something about her didn't feel right. He sped past her without stopping, but in his rearview mirror he saw her standing there, staring after him, her eyes glowing in the darkness. Shaken by the encounter, Jake tried to push the image of the old woman out of his mind. He turned on the radio, hoping for some music to calm his nerves, but all he got was static. Frustrated, he flipped through the channels, but every station was the same, just white noise. Then, amidst the static, he heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of his engine, but as he strained to listen, the voice grew clearer. "Turn back. You're not welcome here." Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The voice was distorted as if coming from an old, malfunctioning radio. He tried to ignore it, but it kept repeating, growing louder with each mile he drove. "Turn back now, or you'll never leave." Suddenly, the radio went dead, and the silence in the cab was deafening. Jake's hands shook as he reached for his thermos, taking a long swig of coffee to steady himself. He wasn't one to scare easily, but this was different. This felt personal, like something, or someone, was targeting him. As Jake pressed on, the road ahead became increasingly treacherous. Thick fog rolled in, obscuring his view, and the curves of the mountain road grew sharper, more dangerous. He slowed down, his eyes scanning the road for any signs of danger. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something in the distance, a pair of taillights. Another truck was ahead of him, moving slowly through the fog. Relieved to see another vehicle, Jake decided to follow it, hoping it would lead him through the worst of the weather. But as he drew closer, something about the truck seemed off. It was an old model, rusted and battered, its license plate caked in mud. There were no company logos, no identifying marks, just an ominous black truck that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Jake tried to radio the driver, but there was no response. He flashed his high beams, but the truck kept its steady pace. Frustrated, Jake decided to pass it. He pulled into the other lane, accelerating to overtake the slow-moving vehicle. But as he passed, he glanced over at the driver's seat and saw no one. The cab was empty. His heart raced as he swerved back into his lane, barely avoiding the guardrail. He looked in his rearview mirror, expecting to see the phantom truck behind him, but it was gone, disappeared into the fog as if it had never been there. Jake's nerves were frayed. Every instinct told him to turn back, but he was too far into the mountains now. He needed to stop, collect his thoughts, and figure out what was happening. Up ahead, he saw a dimly lit gas station, the only sign of life for miles. He pulled into the lot, his tires crunching on the gravel. The gas station looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and the pumps rusted and out of order. But the lights were on, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. Jake stepped out of his truck, the cold night air biting at his skin. As he approached the door, it creaked open on its own. Inside, the station was as empty as it looked from the outside. Dust-covered shelves lined the walls, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Jake called out, but no one answered. He turned to leave, but as he did, he heard it again. The voice from the radio. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice echoed through the empty station, sending a chill down Jake's spine. He spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one there. Just him, standing in the middle of an abandoned gas station, surrounded by silence. Suddenly, The door slammed shut behind him and the lights flickered. Jake's pulse quickened as the air grew colder. He rushed to the door, yanking it open and running back to his truck. As he sped out of the parking lot, he saw it again in his rearview mirror. The black truck sitting silently at the edge of the lot, watching him. Determined to get off the mountain and away from whatever was following him, Jake floored the gas pedal. His truck roared as it barreled down the narrow road, the fog thickening with every mile. The phantom truck was nowhere to be seen, but Jake could feel it, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. As he rounded a sharp bend, his headlights caught a glimpse of something on the side of the road. The old woman. She was standing there again, her hand outstretched, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jake slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just inches from her. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at her through the windshield. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, watching him. Then, without warning, she vanished. Jake gasped, his hands trembling on the wheel. He couldn't take it anymore. Whatever was happening, it was beyond his understanding. He needed to get off this road, and fast. He threw the truck into gear and sped away, his eyes glued to the road ahead. But no matter how far he drove, the feeling of being watched never left him. Something was still out there, following him, waiting for him to make a mistake. By the time Jake reached the small town at the base of the mountain, the sun was just beginning to rise. Exhausted and shaken, he pulled into a diner parking lot and stumbled inside. He needed coffee, something to ground him after the night he'd just endured. As he sat at the counter, sipping his coffee and trying to steady his nerves, he overheard two truckers talking at a nearby table. "Did you hear about the old mountain road? They say it's haunted. Lots of truckers go missing up there, never seen again." Jake's blood ran cold. He had been on that road, and he had survived. But just barely. He paid for his coffee and walked back to his truck, his mind racing. He didn't know what had followed him down that mountain, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never drive that road again. As he climbed into his truck and started the engine, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. And there, in the distance, he saw it. The black truck, sitting at the edge of the lot, watching him. Jake drove away. The image burned into his mind. He knew that no matter how far he went, no matter how many miles he put between himself and that cursed road, the phantom truck would always be with him. A reminder of the nightmare he had escaped, but never truly left behind. Ethan Wilkes had driven the same cross-country route for nearly a decade. From the bustling highways of the East Coast to the sprawling roads of the Midwest, he knew every turn, every rest stop, and every trucker legend. There was one story, though, that haunted even the most seasoned of drivers: the tale of the cursed highway. This particular stretch of road was known to truckers as Route 66B, a desolate and seldom used bypass that cut through miles of uninhabited forest. It saved time, but no one wanted to take it. Over the years, rumors had grown about drivers who ventured down that road and were never seen again. Trucks abandoned, trailers full of goods left to rot, all because of something lurking in the trees, something that didn't want them there. Ethan never believed the rumors. As a no-nonsense kind of guy, he prided himself on being level-headed. But after a series of mechanical failures on his usual route one night, he found himself with no choice. The GPS had recalculated, showing Route 66B as the fastest option to make his delivery on time. With his truck loaded up and the clock ticking, he decided to risk it. The entrance to the route was nothing more than a narrow two-lane road with cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. It was unlit, with trees looming on either side like silent sentinels. The air felt heavy, and the moment Ethan turned onto the bypass, an eerie stillness settled in. His truck's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but endless road and towering trees. But the deeper he went, the more uneasy he felt. He turned on the radio, hoping for some late-night country tunes to ease the tension, but the only thing he got was static. Then, the voices started. At first, Ethan thought it was just interference. Radios could be finicky on remote highways, especially this far out. But as he fiddled with the dial trying to find a station, something strange happened. Amidst the crackling static, he heard what sounded like a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. "Turn back." Ethan froze. His hand hovered over the radio, heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, but there was no one. The road was empty, and the darkness beyond his headlights was impenetrable. He shook his head and laughed nervously. "I've been on the road too long," he muttered to himself, hearing things that aren't there. But the whisper came again, this time clearer. "Turn back, before it's too late." Ethan's skin prickled. He slammed his hand against the radio, cutting it off completely. He didn't need that kind of distraction, but as he drove deeper into the forest, the silence that followed was almost worse. His truck's engine rumbled steadily, but the air felt thick with anticipation, like something was waiting for him up ahead. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in on either side. And though he couldn't explain it, Ethan felt like he was no longer alone. He kept glancing in his mirrors, expecting to see headlights or the shadow of another vehicle. But each time, all he saw was darkness. Still, that feeling wouldn't leave him. The sensation that something or someone was following him. Then, just as he was about to shake off the creeping dread, his headlights illuminated something up ahead. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. Ethan slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching as the massive truck skidded to a halt. The figure stood motionless in the center of the road, bathed in the harsh glare of his headlights. It looked human, but something about its stillness was off. He squinted, trying to make out the details. It appeared to be a man wearing a long coat, but his face was obscured in shadow. The man didn't move, didn't flinch, even as Ethan's truck stopped just a few feet away. For a moment, Ethan sat frozen, gripping the wheel. Every instinct told him to turn the truck around and leave, but his logical mind overruled it. Maybe the guy was in trouble. Maybe he needed help. But why was he just standing there? Ethan leaned out of the window. "Hey, you okay?" he called. The man didn't respond. Ethan cursed under his breath and flicked on his high beams. The bright light flooded the road, revealing the man's face. Or rather, the lack of one. The figure had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin where a face should have been. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, thinking it had to be a trick of the light. But when he looked again, the faceless figure was still there, staring back at him with an empty, expressionless void. Panic surged through him. He threw the truck into reverse, ready to back up and get the hell out of there. But just as he moved, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, leaving nothing but the empty road behind. Ethan's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his heart racing. He scanned the road, half expecting the figure to reappear, but there was nothing. Just the dark, endless highway, shaken but determined to keep going. Ethan put the truck back in gear and started forward again. He had barely gone a mile when the radio crackled to life, louder than before. "You should have turned back." The voice on the radio sent a jolt of terror through Ethan's chest. He fumbled with the dial, trying to turn it off, but the static persisted, growing louder and louder. And then, through the crackling hiss, came that same chilling whisper, "You can't escape." Ethan's heart pounded in his ears as he floored the gas pedal. The truck roared forward, the headlights cutting through the inky darkness. But no matter how fast he drove, the road stretched on endlessly, with no sign of civilization in sight. The whispering continued, growing more urgent. "You can't outrun it. It's coming for you." Ethan glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the faceless figure chasing after him. But the road behind him was empty. Still, that oppressive sense of being watched clung to him, growing heavier with each passing second. He could feel it now. A presence, something dark and malevolent, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. He stole another glance at the mirror and nearly jumped out of his skin. There, in the back of the truck, was the figure. Its smooth, featureless face stared at him through the reflection, its body shrouded in shadow. Ethan's stomach twisted in terror. "No, no, no, no," he muttered, his voice shaking as he pressed harder on the gas. The truck surged forward, but the figure didn't move. It just sat there, watching him, its blank face a mask of silent menace. The radio crackled again. "It's too late. You're already part of the road." Sweat dripped down Ethan's forehead as he gripped the wheel, knuckles white with tension. The figure in the back seat remained motionless, its faceless head turned towards him, unblinking and silent. Every mile felt like a lifetime, and yet the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him with no end in sight. As the minutes dragged on, Ethan's mind raced. He didn't know what was happening or how to stop it. All he knew was that he had to get off this cursed road, whatever it took. But every time he thought he saw a turnoff or a side road, it vanished, swallowed up by the darkness. He slammed his hand against the dashboard in frustration, his nerves fraying with every second. "Come on, come on," he shouted, his voice cracking. But there was no escape. The road kept going, winding deeper into the forest, the trees growing closer and more oppressive. The radio, which had been silent for a few moments, crackled back to life, and the whispering returned. "You're part of it now. You belong to the road." Ethan felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. He had heard stories of truckers who disappeared on this route, their rigs found abandoned, their bodies never recovered. Was that what was happening to him? Was he becoming one of them? The road ahead seemed to blur, the edges of reality bending as the whispering voices grew louder, more insistent. The figure in the back seat remained, its faceless head turned towards Ethan as if waiting for something. Ethan's breathing was ragged, his heart pounding in his chest as he searched for any sign of an exit. But the road was endless, stretching on into eternity. He had no choice but to keep driving. And then, up ahead, he saw something. Lights, faint and distant but unmistakable. A gas station, or a rest stop. Relief surged through him, and he pressed harder on the gas, desperate to reach it. But as he drew closer, the lights flickered and faded, like a mirage in the desert. The station vanished, leaving only the empty road behind. Ethan's hope crumbled. He was trapped, caught in a nightmare with no way out. Max Carlson had been a trucker for nearly 20 years, and in that time he'd seen and heard it all. From strange lights in the sky to people walking along desolate highways in the middle of the night, nothing fazed him anymore. He was used to the solitude of the open road, the long stretches of nothing but asphalt and the hum of his engine. But this night felt different. It was just after midnight, and Max was cruising down a remote highway deep in the heart of the desert. The sky was an endless black void, the stars faint and distant, and the only sound was the low rumble of his truck's engine. He had the radio on low, more for company than anything else, but the usual static of the stations fading in and out didn't bother him. As he reached for his coffee, something strange happened. The radio, which had been playing a soft country tune, suddenly cut to static, followed by a loud, high-pitched tone. Max winced, his hand freezing over the coffee cup. He turned the volume down, but the sound persisted, a shrill, eerie tone that grated on his nerves. He glanced at the radio in confusion. He was miles from any town, and the last station had cut out a while back. But then, through the static and the tone, he heard something else. A voice, faint and garbled, but unmistakable. Max leaned in, trying to make out the words. The voice was muffled, distorted, but he could hear it clearly enough to understand. It was repeating the same thing over and over again. "Help me, please. Help me." A chill ran down Max's spine. He turned the radio off, but the voice didn't stop. It continued, faint but persistent, echoing through the cab even though the radio was dead silent. Max's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he drove in silence, the voice still whispering through the dead air of the cab. He turned the radio back on, hoping that maybe it was just interference from some distant station. But as soon as the radio powered on, the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Help me, please. Help me." Max's heart raced. He knew this stretch of road well. There was nothing out here for miles. No towns, no houses, no people. The voice, it seemed, was coming from nowhere. "Who is this?" Max muttered under his breath, though he knew no one could hear him. The voice didn't respond. It just kept repeating the same haunting plea. Max shook his head, trying to shake off the growing unease that gnawed at him. It had to be some sort of prank or interference from a far-off radio tower. Maybe it was a recording from a distress signal that had been bouncing around the airwaves for years. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but the voice wouldn't let him. It seemed to be getting louder, more desperate with each passing minute. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The radio fell silent, and for a brief moment Max thought it was over. But then, a different sound came through the speakers. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew in volume, filling the cab with a low, mournful sobbing. Max's skin crawled as he realized what he was hearing. Someone, or something, was crying. Max's heart pounded in his chest as the sobbing continued, echoing through the cab like a ghostly wail. He glanced nervously at his rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat. But the cab was empty, just as it had been all night. The sobbing grew louder, more anguished, and Max felt a surge of panic. He reached for the radio again, turning the dial frantically in an attempt to find a station, any station, that would drown out the eerie sound. But no matter how much he fiddled with the controls, the sobbing persisted, louder and louder until it filled every inch of the truck. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Max saw something. In the rearview mirror, just for a split second, he caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure sitting in the back of the cab. It was gone as soon as he looked directly at it, but the image lingered in his mind. A figure hunched over, head bowed, its face hidden in the darkness. Max's breath hitched in his throat. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white, and kept his eyes on the road. He wasn't sure what he had just seen, or if he had seen anything at all. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the dim glow of his dashboard. But the sobbing hadn't stopped. The highway stretched out endlessly before Max, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren desert. But no matter how far he drove, the sobbing followed him, clinging to the air like a dark cloud. Max's mind raced. He had heard stories from other truckers, tales of ghostly hitchhikers and strange figures seen along lonely stretches of highway. But he had never believed any of it, until now. The figure he had seen in the mirror, the voice on the radio, the sobbing. It was all too real, and it was getting closer. Max glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see someone sitting there, but it was empty, just like the rest of the cab. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He pressed harder on the gas, hoping to outrun whatever was haunting him. But the faster he drove, the louder the sobbing became. It was as if the figure in the back seat was drawing closer, inching its way toward him with every mile. Max's hands shook as he glanced at the mirror again. This time, the figure was there, sitting upright in the back seat, its face still hidden in shadow. But there was something new, a pair of glowing eyes staring at him through the darkness. Max's blood ran cold. He slammed his foot on the brake, bringing the truck to a screeching halt in the middle of the highway. The sobbing stopped abruptly, and for a brief moment, the silence was deafening. But when Max turned to face the back seat, it was empty. Max sat frozen in the driver's seat, his heart racing, his mind spinning. The figure was gone, but the memory of those glowing eyes lingered in the darkness, burning in his mind. He had to get out of here. Without thinking, Max threw the truck into gear and floored the gas, the engine roaring to life as he sped down the highway. He didn't care where he was going anymore. He just needed to get away from whatever had been in his truck. But as he drove, the radio crackled to life again. This time it wasn't a voice or sobbing. It was a low, raspy breathing, like someone struggling to take their last breaths. Max's heart pounded in his chest as the breathing grew louder, more labored. And then, through the static, a voice spoke, cold, hollow, and full of malice. "You can't escape," it said. "You're already dead." Max's blood turned to ice. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again, but the back seat was still empty. "Who are you?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. The radio crackled, and the voice responded, "You picked me up. Now you'll never be free." Max's stomach churned. He had never picked up anyone, not tonight, not ever. But the voice on the radio seemed to know something he didn't. And then, the figure appeared again. Not in the mirror, but in the passenger seat beside him. It sat silently, its glowing eyes fixed on Max, its shadowy form looming in the darkness. Max slammed on the brakes. But the figure didn't move. It just stared at him, unblinking, as the radio continued to hiss and crackle. "You'll never be free," the voice whispered again, sending a chill down Max's spine. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the figure beside him, its eyes glowing in the dim light of the cab. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he knew was that he had to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The radio crackled again, the voice growing louder, more menacing. "You're mine now." Max's hands shook as he reached for the door handle, desperate to escape. But before he could pull it open, the figure reached out, its cold, shadowy hand closing over his arm. A jolt of icy pain shot through Max's body, paralyzing him. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. All he could do was watch as the figure leaned in closer, its face still hidden in shadow, but its eyes burning with a malevolent light. "You'll drive forever," the voice whispered. "You'll never be free." Max's vision blurred as the cold seeped deeper into his bones. He could feel his body growing weaker, his mind slipping away. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the highway stretching out endlessly before him, the figure beside him, and the sound of the radio crackling with static. When Max woke up, he was still behind the wheel, the highway stretching out endlessly before him. But something was different. The air was colder, the sky darker, and the truck, it felt different. He glanced around, his heart racing as he realized he wasn't alone. The figure was still there, sitting beside him, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Max's hands gripped the steering wheel as the voice on the radio crackled to life again. "You'll drive forever," it whispered. "There's no escape." Max tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was trapped, bound to the road, the figure beside him a constant reminder of the fate he couldn't escape. And so, he drove. David Harlow had been on the road for nearly 15 hours, with only the endless stretch of highway and his thoughts for company. He was hauling a load of cargo across several states and planned to reach a truck stop in the next couple of hours. It was a quiet night, the kind where the only light came from the occasional passing vehicle and the soft glow of his dashboard. As David cruised along the empty road, something caught his eye. Up ahead, standing at the side of the highway, was a figure, a man, thumb out, hitchhiking in the dead of night. The figure was illuminated briefly by his headlights, and despite the eerie vibe, David slowed down. The rule for most truckers was simple. You don't pick up strangers, especially on these desolate highways. But there was something about this man that drew David in. Perhaps it was the desperate look in his eyes or the way he shivered in the cold night air. Against his better judgment, David pulled over. As the man approached, David noticed that he was wearing an old, tattered coat. His face was gaunt, and his eyes had a hollow, haunted look to them. "You need a lift?" David asked, his voice barely audible over the rumble of his truck's engine. The man nodded silently and climbed into the cab, offering no explanation for why he was out here in the middle of nowhere. As they drove in silence, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His new passenger stared straight ahead, barely blinking, and hadn't uttered a word since getting into the truck. For miles, neither David nor the hitchhiker spoke. The silence was thick, and the only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the occasional bump of the tires on the uneven road. David's mind raced with questions, but he didn't dare ask. The man's presence felt wrong, as if he didn't belong here. Finally, David cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "Where are you headed?" The hitchhiker slowly turned to look at David, his eyes dark and unreadable. After a moment, he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "Nowhere in particular. Just trying to get far away." David frowned. "Far away from what?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the road, his face expressionless. David felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't help but feel that he had made a mistake picking this guy up. As the miles stretched on, the air in the cab grew colder. David adjusted the heater, but it didn't seem to help. He glanced over at the hitchhiker, who was sitting unnaturally still, his hands resting on his knees. "You all right, man?" David asked, trying to sound casual. The hitchhiker didn't respond. David's heart pounded in his chest as the eerie silence filled the truck once more. He began to regret his decision to stop for this man. After what felt like an eternity, the hitchhiker finally spoke again, his voice even quieter than before. "They're coming for me." David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Who's coming for you?" The man turned slowly to face David, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand. They follow me everywhere. They never stop." David swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He had heard his share of strange stories from fellow truckers, but this was something else. "Who follows you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The hitchhiker leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The shadows. They're always watching, waiting for me to let my guard down." David felt a knot of dread form in his stomach. He had heard enough. Whatever this man was talking about, it was too much for him. He needed to get this guy out of his truck, and fast. "I think it's time I drop you off at the next stop," David said, trying to sound firm. The hitchhiker's expression darkened. "You can't escape them. No one can." Before David could respond, a loud bang echoed through the cab, startling him. He swerved slightly, his heart racing. The hitchhiker didn't flinch, his gaze fixed on something in the darkness outside the truck. "They're here," the man whispered, his voice trembling. David's heart raced as he scanned the road ahead. At first he saw nothing, just the empty stretch of highway bathed in the dim light of his headlights. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement, dark shapes darting along the roadside, barely visible in the shadows. His blood ran cold. He hit the gas, trying to put as much distance between him and whatever was out there. The truck roared as it sped down the highway, but no matter how fast he went, the shadows seemed to keep pace. The hitchhiker was muttering to himself now, rocking back and forth in his seat. "They're coming. They're coming." David's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the wheel. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he had to get away from it. The dark shapes were growing closer, their forms more distinct now, human-like figures, but twisted, elongated, their limbs moving unnaturally fast. Panic surged through David. He had never seen anything like this before, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could outrun them. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt with no sign of safety in sight. Desperation clawed at David's chest. He couldn't keep driving like this forever. His eyes flicked to the hitchhiker, who was now mumbling incoherently, his eyes wide with terror. Whatever these things were, they were after him, and now David was caught in the middle of it. In the distance, David spotted an exit ramp leading to a small town. It wasn't on his route, but he didn't care. He needed to get off this highway, away from the shadows that were relentlessly pursuing them. He swerved onto the ramp, the truck lurching as it sped toward the town. The shapes followed, skittering along the roadside, their unnatural movements making David's skin crawl. As the truck barreled into the town, the shadows seemed to slow, lingering at the edge of the road as if they were hesitant to enter. David's pulse quickened with hope. Maybe he could outrun them after all. But then, without warning, the hitchhiker screamed. "They're inside!" David's blood turned to ice. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, one of the shadowy figures sitting in the back of the cab, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. David's heart pounded in his chest as he slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt in the middle of the empty street. He turned to face the hitchhiker, but the man was no longer there. In his place sat one of the twisted, shadowy figures, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. David scrambled to open the door, his hands shaking. He had to get out. He had to run. But before he could escape, the figure spoke, its voice a distorted, echoing whisper. "You can't run from us. You're part of this now." David's breath hitched in his throat as the figure reached out, its long, twisted fingers grazing his arm. He felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through his body, paralyzing him in place. The shadows outside the truck swarmed closer, their twisted forms pressing against the windows, surrounding the vehicle like a living nightmare. David's vision blurred as the cold crept up his spine, and he realized with dawning horror that there was no escape. The last thing David saw before darkness consumed him was the twisted figure's glowing eyes, staring deep into his soul.